Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Really excited about this event. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. So I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, present, past, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. So my name is Dan Dioka, and I'm an associate professor in practice here at the GSD, and I'm really honored to have this chance to introduce our distinguished guest, Wanda Dalla Costa. A couple of items of housekeeping before we start. I introduce our speaker. We have live captioning available tonight for the virtual audience. To enable captions, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live screen window. Also want to invite you all to join us for an upcoming GSD public program. It'll be on Thursday, November 17th at 6:30 p.m. So we'll hear from the 2019 Wheelwright Prize winner, Alexandra Yeska. Her lecture will be the final public program of the fall semester. And so now for tonight's event, which is supported by the Rachel Dorothy Tanur Memorial Lecture Fund, which was established in 2006 and funded by alumnus Reuben Mark. It is named for Tanur, who was an urban planner and lawyer who cared deeply about people, their lives, and their living conditions. So again, it's really my honor to introduce Wanda Dalla Costa, someone I hadn't met actually until tonight in person, but somebody I really felt I knew, owing in part to how often her work was discussed in some of the studios that I've taught. She is doubtless one of the leading voices for Indigenous design and education in North America right now. A few snippets from some recent interviews will suggest why. So she said that, quote, we've designed our cities based on what was done in other places, but we never looked to the existing place, to what happened in that place, what was special about that place, and how to lift that up to recreate something hyper-local. Totally agree. Another quote, we need to bring a more broad, comprehensive, holistic view of what architecture really does and what it can be. It should impact the social, ecological, cultural, spatial, physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental. It does so much more than we give it credit, much more than we have given it credit for in the past. Couldn't have put it better myself. One more quote. When I look at our firm, and what we are aiming to do, I can't justify what I do as architecture. It's ethnography, really. We create spaces of possibility, plurality, relationality, spatial agency, and resilience. We look at cultural research and associated protocols. We should all be so inspired. So you've all have access to Wanda's bio, so I won't read it in detail. Some quick highlights. She's a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. She was the first First Nation woman to become an architect in Canada. In 2022, she was honored as an honorary fellow of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada. Her firm is based in Phoenix, Arizona, and she also teaches in Arizona at Arizona State University, where she's the director and founder of the Indigenous Design Collaborative. Her teaching and research, as we'll see, are focused on Indigenous ways of knowing and being, co-design methodologies, sustainable design, and the resiliency of vernacular architectures. So grateful you were able to join us tonight. Really looking forward to your talk. Please join me in welcoming Wanda Dalla Costa.
That was a great introduction. Thank you so much for bringing those quotes. So today I want to focus on an idea that I've been very interested in, and that idea is about awakening ancestral systems. Specifically, knowledge systems, organizational systems, and value systems, all of which rise through the process of architecture. I suspect that awakening these systems will provide additional artillery to counteract the challenges that we currently face, from environmental degradation to social justice issues. Ancestral systems are not about living in the past, no, but are about connecting the old with the new. This notion of bridging the old and new exists in many cultures. The Maori call this ka mua ka muri, or walking backward into the future, the term that I borrow for today's talk. As the Maori say, remembering the past is important to move forward. What is ahead is unknown, but learning from what has gone before can guide us into a better future. I started this mission about 25 or so years ago in trying to move the needle in architecture, basically to be more inclusive and more representational of a broader range of voices. Whose voices? Well, before I entered architecture school, those of you that have known my past, I had a really long backpacking journey that started out as 6 months and turned into 7 years, where I was traipsing around the world with a backpack, living on a shoestring. And going from places like Indonesia or India to Australia, I saw so many different cultures. They were still living in their traditional architectures. They were still practicing their life ways. And so when I returned to North America, I kind of thought, well, what happened? What can we start to bridge and to reconnect? So that trip lasted a long time, but it inspires my work. And now my mission is to really uplift those ancestral cultures. The more I listen and the more I learn from the communities, I think it's been at least a couple of decades now, I realize that these lessons surpass architecture. Awakening ancestral systems can benefit, I think, many fields. We are at an opportune time for this awakening of ancestral systems because of two things. First, I believe our field is starting to show signs, the field of architecture, even urban planning, urban design, is starting to show signs of reflection and contemplation right now. Many are questioning the status quo in architecture. The second reason I think this is an opportune time is because our planet is in a time of change. Floods, water shortages, food scarcity, and so forth. Everyone knows the concept of the canary bird. You know, in the mines, those were the birds that used to detect the harmful gases. They were the first to notice. And I think that is relevant here today. I have used that phrase, the canary bird, to define Indigenous people, many of whom live very close to the land and see and sense ecological change. I would also say many of you are within the collective of canary birds that are also witnessing change, and not only witnessing, but having to find solutions for these changes. The research we are undertaking at both my practice Tawau as well as the IDC, the Indigenous Design Collaborative, is centered on Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. The work to me is very broad. It goes far beyond Native American in the traditional sense. The United Nations released a paper that was entitled, "Who Are Indigenous People?" They cited that one aspect of being Indigenous, and I point out number 7 below, is that you aspire to maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems as distinct people and communities. I think if you look at this definition, this could apply to people in Dubai, in Shanghai, or India, as much as it is relevant to North America. Within our research team, we are looking constantly for global examples of walking backwards into the future. As researchers, we're looking for patterns, we're looking for commonalities, we're looking for stories, systems, and solutions among the many nations. According to the United Nations, there are 5,000 global Indigenous cultures, totaling over 370 million people worldwide. Let me share some examples. I was watching a show called Examined, a show that reviews random curiosities of modern culture, from how to create an effective apology to the transformation norms in the plastic surgery industry. The episode I was watching was on hurricanes. It focused on Louisa, Puerto Rico, which I learned was also the origin of bamba music. Louisa is not a prosperous region. In fact, it has been left out of urban development and infrastructure upgrades. Its geography, surrounded by water, combined with poverty, made the town particularly vulnerable to Hurricane Maria in 2017, which brought 6-feet-high waves and destroyed 3,000 homes. The town is also known as one of the cultures within Puerto Rico. It is a mixed Afro-Caribbean identity, a population that was formed by runaway slaves. The town is becoming part of a global pattern. Poorer communities occupy flood-prone regions. These communities can also be subject to compounding challenges, such as contamination from industrial plants on their lands. The poor communities are also less likely to get help. As you know, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, yet help was slow. And the solutions came from a very faraway place. Government administrators who don't personally face or know the risks were making the decisions. Those decisions rule over the experience of local people who have lived in the region and carry centuries of ecological understanding. I learned that the local Puerto Ricans had ancestral systems of disaster preparedness. The locals could predict storms by observing a combination of high feathery clouds and birds coming home to roost at unusual times. This was their survivance system. It was an ancestral system. On the left of the screen is New York City. On the right is a mangrove in India. While New York posed a $10 billion solution to extend the shoreline into the river, India recently awakened an ancestral system. Bandamal, India, was in the path of a storm, but the town was protected by a mangrove forest. Mangroves, as you know, act as a physical sponge. It's a self-repairing ecosystem that can outpace sea level rise. Wetlands, sand dunes, reefs can all hold furies of water that often work better than the battered walls, which always serve to lessen the ground conditions. Ancestral systems have are plentiful in Julia Watson's recent book called Low Tech, Design by Radical Indigenism. The author calls this era, which she calls a high-tech era, which is occurring alongside climate extremes, as one that is drowning in information and starving for wisdom. Her mission is to begin a movement based on Indigenous philosophies and vernacular infrastructures in order to generate sustainable, resilient, nature-based technologies. Her book delves into millennia-old human ingenuity to determine how we will live in symbiosis with nature. This movement rebuilds our understanding, collective understanding, using Indigenous philosophies in relation to design in order to generate sustainable, resilient infrastructures. In doing so, her book and her theory fills a void, which I think I'm so excited about because we're finally at this place where she is looking at the void in intersection between innovation, architecture, urbanism, conservation, and indigenism. And I truly believe that once hybridized and scaled, these indigenous technologies could offer a new path to exponentially shrink the ecological footprint of humankind. What I think is important with her work as well is that it lifts up old technologies in service of new problems. She reminds us, which I think is really important today, that indigenous knowledges evolve. Let's look a bit deeper into an indigenous worldview. And again, I'm going very broad here because I think it's important to understand why indigenous people are singled out in the movement of ecology. And it's because the relationship between the natural system and the human system. In the indigenous worldview, in both historic and contemporary times, there's an understanding of internal connectivity between humans and the natural world that necessitates a reciprocity and a respect between all living things. This indigenous view of the world, what we refer to in our home community as ethical relationality, is practiced across many biomes around the world. These relationships, humans, plants and animals, and even oftentimes what many people think of as inanimate, such as rocks and mountains, are all considered animate beings within the same family, and all require constant fostering for the relationship to continue. This idea brings up something very critical within the indigenous worldview, and that is prioritizing the collective over the individual. In these systems, time and space move fluidly backward and forward between generations, offering and sharing moments of negotiation, reflection, and change. People are thought to walk forward into the past and backward into the future, both taking place in the present. These holistic knowledge systems are now being examined by a host of scholars and practitioners worldwide, proponents like Watson, and those who pursue similar productive disruptions in their fields, whether they're an ethnobotanist or an ethnogeologist. There are many ethnos these days in the work. They all together assist in making a case for alternative paths to our conventional systems. I think at the end of, this, speaking about Indigenous knowledge systems and the systems that exist, I think there's a bigger question, and it's a more important question that we have to ask, and that is, what has to give way or change in order to make room for holistic knowledge systems to infiltrate our professions? O'Sullivan, many of you probably know, the director of Wellington's Faculty of Architecture and Design Innovation, offers thoughts on how we get there. He says that to undertake the increasingly wicked issues alongside the requisite companion to wicked issues, which is social responsibility, that these holistic approaches need to be seen as fundamental to our future. Watson, the author of Low Tech, has a similar piece of advice. She reminds us that we may need to relinquish a number of things, and she calls us to relinquish the heroic, Eurocentric models currently followed in our profession toward a more culturally calibrated compass. So let's shift a bit. I want to shift and examine some systems that might be part of Watson's new compass and think through where it may lead us. So I brought 3 systems to kind of go through that come from our practice: value systems, knowledge system, and organizational systems. And then I will follow this with our process of how we do our architecture and how we're trying to change the process in order to change the project, the products. And then I'll share with you, and I think I brought 7 projects to brief through with you. So let's talk about value systems. I've got 2 examples. The first one is the teepee. So I'm Cree, we're from very far north, and this is our traditional architecture. It seems very simple, a piece of canvas or a piece of hide, some poles and a fire inside, very simple, but to us, it is inlaid with meaning. In our community, there are 13 teepee poles, and each one of those teepee poles has a meaning. Humility, respect, wisdom, generosity, sharing, really beautiful value systems that every time you erect a teepee, you are reminded. Many of you have probably seen these value systems. They come from New Zealand. Te Aranga is the system, and it's a value-based system which is now embedded in Auckland's design manual. It proposes urban designs that connect to Indigenous social practices that occur over generations. The values on screen that you see include unity, cohesion, collaboration, belonging, understanding, holistic hospitality, and so forth. To me, when I see these values, this is the kind of city I want to live in. The key objective, I should remind everyone, of the Te Aranga principles is not just for Indigenous people. It's being enacted in the city of Auckland to enhance all of the appreciation of the natural world and the built environment, while it is teaching how to foster culturally appropriate design processes and design responses. Let's switch to knowledge systems. In a recent podcast, there's a group in Arizona called Well for Culture. They're very cool. They have an Indigenous philosophy on wellness. It's very, very interesting. They're a dynamic duo. They're part of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, and they are making waves in their theory. The Chelsea, one of the partners, refers to our elders in a recent podcast as PhDs, not, of course, in the conventional academic sense. But she also talks about cultural bearers being PhDs and land-based knowledge carriers being PhDs. That notion that knowledge lives in many places was articulated also in a recent paper by a group of Indigenous scholars. The paper, you should definitely look it up if you're interested in this topic. It's called Weaving Indigenous and Sustainability Sciences to Diversify Our Methods. It's a fantastic paper. But what I wanted to highlight from that paper today is they brought forth in that paper 4 different types of Indigenous knowledges. Traditional knowledge, which is handed down based on stories and experiences of people through time. The second one is empirical knowledge gained through observation and practice over time. Revealed knowledge, which is gained through vision, ritual, and ceremony. And finally, contemporary knowledge, which is where we are now through education and problem solving. So imagine if every project you did, or for every school or higher education architectural project, you had to find a place for those 4 knowledges to be hosted. I think it changes architecture as we know it. As another example I want to share with you of a knowledge system, I recently came across this fellow on TikTok. His name is Lenny Akwikiak, an Inuit man who is showing the world a day in the life of Inuit people. Chelsea from the Well for Culture group in Arizona might say he's a land-based PhD. Yesterday, I learned from Lenny that the dark clouds, if you look at the image on the lower right-hand side, the dark clouds show there's open water on the sea ice, which of course can be very dangerous. The brighter clouds, which shift to the right of the image, are a safe travel route. He and his community know the land by both landmarks as well as these shifting patterns, and that all the aspects of his physical world have been named. That knowledge, Lenny says, is passed on from generation to generation. Again, another knowledge system, a land-based PhD. The last organization system I bring to you is that of the elders, and it's our most important system, I believe. Beyond being our PhDs, they also act as our moral compass. They are the watchdogs, ensuring that all decisions are in the best interest of the collective group. They look back to look forward, taking lessons from the past, but also thinking of future generations. In most communities, they have something called an elders' council, called upon to oversee decisions and directions for the entire community. Now, imagine for a minute, in our current world, in our, the Western settler current world that we all inhabit, what if our current global challenges, whether it's depleting water bodies, disputes over energy, economic disparity, were governed by a moral collective of elders? Imagine that the elders oversaw the distribution of resources, helped to move populations at risk, or acted as mediators to polarize political figures. That is also a world I would want to be part of. So those 3, the value systems, knowledge systems, and organizational systems that exist within our community, these are some of the things that we're trying to lift up in our practice. And while I continue to find an abundance of valuable ideas within our communities, there are also an equal number of powerful ideas emerging in contemporary scholarship and practice that I think are very related to the Indigenous worldview and worth bringing up today. And when you look at, for most of you, if you haven't heard that saying called two-eyed seeing, that's when you look from an Indigenous and a settler or a Western view. It's a way of looking at the world. So let's two-eyed see for a minute and look at 3 theories that are emerging that I think are very related to Indigenous practices. Transition design, many of you know, was started back in 2012, led by Terry Irwin at Carnegie Mellon University. Irwin just received the 2021 AIGA Medal in recognition of her vision to shape design philosophy. Why is it similar to Indigenous philosophy? Transition design recognizes interdependent and symbiotic relationships. It also aims to walk forward and backward. Proponents use something called future visioning to imagine ideal lifestyles at a time when wicked problems no longer exist. And it does something called backcasting to think what to do now and make an action plan. A second movement that is occurring that I think is related to Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing is cosmopolitan localism. which aims to foster a global network of mutually supportive communities, neighborhoods, villages, towns, and so forth, in order that they can share and exchange knowledge, ideals, skills, technology, culture, and resources. There is a reciprocal relationship in this system between the hyper-local, the uber-local, and the global. But what I think is so important about this work is that it focuses on localized assets and local thinking. And it helps to avoid what's happening in a lot of cities, that sort of subsuming of local cultures within this homogenized global system. A third recent movement, and the last recent movement that I wanted to bring to you, is also coming through mainstream literature. It came through a book, and the book I was reading was called Nomad Century. It's fantastic, and it's a commentary on how climate mitigation will reshape our world. The author, Gaia Vince, shares that changes will instigate a planned migration for many around the world, and this will necessitate rethinking boundaries and borders that we hang on to. She proposes a very radical idea in this world, and she says we need a global community without borders that will enable those who are in danger to relocate. So those three Western systems, I think, are very important and very relevant to Indigenous design, and I hope they provide a bit of two-eyed seeing that makes what I'm referring to a little more easy to understand. One thing I wanted to bring up before we get into the projects, it's a final concept, and I think it's critical for us, when Watson asked the question, what do we do now? How do we take this forward? I think this is part of the work that we have to do. When Watson was talking about relinquishing some things in order to move toward a more culturally calibrated compass, many of you have seen Black Panther, the movie, in the city of Wakanda. That is called, scholars are referring to that as Afrofuturity. And you remember that beautiful city that was there, full of unique design, even the regalia, but it also illustrated value systems. Do you remember that they were very high-tech? They had a very high technological system that they had a lot of medical knowledge. And I think that's a value system that they aspire to be. These imaginary worlds that are being created bring people hope and vision as they see their cultural lifeways, assets, and value systems expressed in physical form. I would also say that these worlds may not look like what is being taught in architecture schools in the last few decades. They don't subscribe to the sort of formalistic fascination, the gymnastics that our 3D skills allow us to do, nor do they fall into the sort of modernist, mechanistic efficiency that relegates our bodies and our minds to being passive receptors. Here, the physical built form is tactile. It is alive with the hands that built these forms, alive with meaning and connection, and designed as a catalyst to expand relatability and expand our consciousness, and most important, to expand our sense of belonging. That concept of futurities was brought to the Indigenous academic world by Dr. Grace Dillon. She defines Indigenous futurities as past future visions where we construct self-determined representations and alternative narratives about our identities and our futures. What she hoped was that futurity, the notion of a futurity, could challenge assumptions that consign Native American peoples and lifeways to the past, and by using creative thinking as a pathway toward Indigenous revival. Indigenous futurities is emerging in many disciplines. Architectures, I'm trying to push it through in architecture, but it's coming up in art, in gaming, and in medicine. The work on screen is an example from the art world. And the cover of my talk tonight, the women in the beautiful regalia, that was also an example of Indigenous futurities. So before I share a few of our projects, I wanted to talk about our process briefly. As I mentioned, I think we have to change the process in order to change the final products. I operate both my private practice, Tawau, and the Indigenous Design Collaborative under a very similar model. We have a lot of Indigenous designers. I'm hoping to provide us like a safe landing pad for Indigenous designers when they get out of school. I was just sharing a story that the other day that the corporate world in architecture was quite intimidating. I'm first generation. And so I wanted to create a very casual office. We have so come and join us in Phoenix. We have a very casual office there. But the idea behind both the firm and IDC is to mix that with, at first it was a lot of international designers that don't come in with any preconceptions and don't come in with any knowledge of Indigenous design. And we mix them together to see what happens. And it's worked it's really, really interesting, I think, the process. And so that mix, the outside combined with those on the inside, is the way we enable to move. So our vision, I say, is preparing our designers to act as field transformation ambassadors through the power of place design and cultures-based innovation. The mission is not only to increase understanding, but also inclusiveness and accuracy in the field. And, of course, to illuminate ancestral worldviews and value systems that I think can be useful for global transformation. The man on the lower right-hand side, many of you may have heard of him, Claudio Vexstein. He was one of the first faculty to jump into the IDC and to help us with our work. And so a lot of the work in our firm is influenced by him. And the rest, of course, are our Indigenous graduates that come and work for us and with us. Our process, you see, is slightly different. Let me see if I can operate this. So when I went to school, we kind of were taught to kind of start around right here somewhere and then just go into the design process. But for me, I feel like there's a lot of work that had to be done before I can understand a community when we design for them. So we start off by doing place-based research, and it could be anything from ecologies or archetypes or meaning and materiality. We look at regalia, we look at beadwork, patterning, anything that can drive the inspiration. And then after that, we start this community-led teaching phase where they're teaching us about their community. It's very important to add co-pilots. So this is where we add our co-pilots. We do a series of engagements. We analyze what we've heard in association with the community, and then we create a series of design drivers or design principles that guide us through the work and act as our North Stars. I think what's also different from our purpose is the final 3 components on the end. Yes, there's a building or a design or a rendering that results from it, but I think more importantly, there's a story that's being told. When we do all that place-based research, which we sort of put in our back pocket, just so that we're familiar with the community before we go in, we collect maps, we collect quotes and narratives and stories and imagery. We have so much information that we felt we couldn't just put it in a folder and tuck it away, that we needed to put it into a book or a video or some medium so that we could share it with the world. The other thing that we're doing, which is pictured right here, is we're measuring outcomes of our work. So, in the academic research, I'm not a PhD, but I've understood the system of measuring through all the grants that we do, measuring indicators and creating impact measurements at the beginning of a process. So I thought, could we do that in architecture? Could we say, what is most important to the community? Have them tell us, and then we measure our work against it at the end. So this is one of our processes. When we think about people ask us, well, what are you learning about? What are you talking about when you go into community? We are trying to codify this right now because there is such an abundance of information that comes at us when we go into community. They've never been asked, a lot of these communities. So their generosity is really fantastic, and it really drives all of our projects. And so we are looking at creating a codification system right now for the work. And I think when we think of, how architectural process has been, so when I started, it was very similar to the sort of master, tutor, willing servant, and I don't know how much of that has changed in recent years, but I think it's time, if we thought about maybe we can change it into something else, this is what I think it would look like, if I was to imagine. This is a youth engagement that we did for the Chippewa of Thames in Eastern Canada. And this is the way our new compass looks. Again, maybe we continue to do this work for 10 years and maybe we'll reach a point of saturation and we don't need more information, but I doubt it. I have a feeling that we will be able to continue to sort of innovate in our work in the field by going into community. So now we get to the projects. So what I want to share with you, I've ordered the projects according to the 7 tenets of cultural sustainability theory. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it was a paper that I read. Sometimes you read a paper and it just sort of changes everything that you previously thought. And it was a paper in 2015, and it was called Redefining Architecture to Accommodate Cultural Difference. It was by Paul Memmott and Kathy Keyes. And they basically tried to find a model of looking at architecture that would be sensitive to cross-cultural contexts and values and not overly dominated by Western ideas. And so when I looked at these principles, they were also game-changing in our architecture work. So I often like to talk about our projects through these principles. So the first principle, and the first principle says the use of space is influenced by our cultural backgrounds. What you see on screen is the Colorado River Indian Tribe Justice Center in Parker, Arizona. This was done by the IDC. And as you know, justice in the Native American way is more about restoring the person. It's restorative justice system. So I'm guessing that those architectures should look different. If you were restoring someone, what would those look like? And so this was some of the ideas, and Claudio worked on this project as well. There were symbols, there was water, there were plants, there was natural daylight, there were soft colors. It's a different way of looking at a justice center. The second principle of cultural sustainability theory says that human needs and environmental attributes are complex, and if aligned well, lead to increasing complementary functionality. The building on the lower right-hand corner was the building that we were given to create the Indigenous people space it's right across from the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. And there were 3 Indigenous designers, David Fortan and Aledia Smoke and myself. And this colonial building gave us quite a difficult first couple of months to imagine how we would change that to feel Indigenous. Right? It was really difficult, and so we found out, we talked to the mechanical folks, and the building envelope was failing. So we thought, great, this is we can just wrap it up. And some of the Indigenous designers on the team wanted to just demolish it, and I said, you know what? I think we should keep this because it almost now exists like a message in a bottle, like you're preserving this thing encased in glass. It's a piece of our history. But of course, the wrapper looks very different. When we talk about it, there's a lot of meaning within this exterior wrapper that you see on the building. It's inspired by the rounded shapes of the wigwam. It's referencing Father Sky above the wigwam. It has a shawl, which signifies gifts in our region and understanding. And all those little feathers or snowshoes that you see on the outside were aiming to be uniquely designed by each of the First Nations in Canada. So it would be a collective design. Also within that space, in order to bring functionality, we created a series of gathering spaces. So gathering for dancing, gathering for ceremony, gathering for socializing, which again is very important in terms of our urban functionality, which urban spaces are where 60% of Indigenous people now live. The third project I bring, and the third tenet of cultural sustainability theory, says, and I love this is a very special one to me, it says that there are ideological, social, and behavioral meanings that need to be understood, including high-level meanings such as worldview, mid-level meanings such as identity, and low-level meanings such as use. So that triad, worldview, identity, and use, has now become one of our metric systems whenever we do a design. And the inside, we connected into an ancestral way of knowing from that local community. They have a system of 13 moons that exist. So you see on the benches, the name of each of the moons, and it became the radial ordering device for that inside space. The fourth tenet of CS theory says that outside decision-making either undermines or reinforces cultural systems. The project on screen is St. Francis Cree Bilingual Elementary School. They realized, the principals and the administrators realized that Indigenous kids weren't doing that great at school, and they realized that they needed to bring more cultural practices for the kids. But doing so in a very conventional school building created a lot of issues because, as you know, we have a history of residential schools in Canada, or boarding schools. I think they were similar here. And there was a trauma associated with the long corridors. There's even trauma associated with certain colors, certain materials. And they asked us if they could create a building with more fluid shapes. Of course, this is not the cheapest way to build a building, but we shared with the leadership group and the administrators that we think it was absolutely necessary to change the way schools looked and were built. With a lot of identity, you see the Cree syllabics written on the outside, and in the inside, there's a number of different ordering systems that order the inside of that school, but most importantly, in the outdoor school, and in the outdoor area in the back, it's all about land-based learning. There are gardens, ethnobotany lives in this place, there's places for storytelling, so it's a massive departure from what a typical school is, and we thought it was important, but we had to push the leadership into this, into working this way. The fifth tenet of cultural sustainability theory says that there are culturally specific understandings of what it means to be well. And this project, they're just finishing the construction. It's at Western University. It's called the Wampum Learning Lodge. The outside is constructed, and what you see is an arbor for storytelling, complete with a sacred fire can be host in that arbor, and then a garden leading down to the Indigenous Student Center. There was no dugout on this property. And when I went down and I saw this downstairs space, there was no light, no views to the outside. And I remember exactly, as a first-generation student, being put in this basement of one of the buildings where all the Native students used to convene, you know, for kind of social support. And it was kind of a depressing little space, but it held us together. It was so strong in terms of solidifying this unit of all these Indigenous students that I thought, oh, let's not make it another basement space with no light, no views. And thankfully, the university administrators went for it, and we dug a hole. Inside, we also designed that drum that you see in the back. It was an old library, and so we actually did some designs to make the space come alive. What you see here, in order to welcome the students to that center, again with the first generation students, we put all the Indigenous greetings inspired by the palisades, you know, the long stick figures that exist outside Indigenous encampments on the east. So we took that idea of the palisades, we added greetings, we added a full kitchen that they can actually cook a Thanksgiving dinner in there, not common in a university, but important. The kitchen is where you hang out. It's just about finished, this room down here. This is a picture in, I don't know, 95% construction level, but it's a storytelling room complete with a fireplace. We have moss walls, living walls in the center, and then of course we also have a recognition of a tribute to our Father Sky. The sixth project I bring, and the sixth tenet of cultural sustainability theory, says that architects are members of cultural groups, enculturated within a social value system. This project was done at Arizona State University. They asked us, they knew we were at the IDC and that we love to create, and so they asked us if we could create a piece of artwork. And so we leaned into the Indigenous students. We talked about a welcome wall in all the Indigenous greetings of all of the tribes of Arizona. So that's what you see on the wall. Then we brought in artists and we said, can you help us to create the graffiti? And of course they created the graffiti. It was a little bit too tilty and graffiti-like. We had to straighten it up a bit. But we now have graffiti on our walls in ASU. And just following after that project was constructed, that one was in using the resin and wood, they asked us if we would create a special table Again, we went to the artists. We got a story from a local Salt River artist called Jeffrey Fulwilder. He's pictured right there in the yellow. And he told us the stories of baskets connected to, his ancestral belief systems in the baskets. So we created a table made of resin and copper for the library. And despite the fact there are more comfortable chairs in the library, this table seems to be packed out on a daily basis. So there you go. So the last project that I brought to share, and the last tenant, says that places are highly symbolic and culturally specific, with cosmological, spiritual, and historical references that become identity markers for groups, societies, and nations. This project is for the Chippewa of Thames. It's a cultural center in eastern Canada. Their ancestral archetypes are they're mound builders. So they asked us if we could reflect using the mound building traditions. And of course, we could. But what I think is more interesting was what happened on the inside. It's a very simplified form on the outside. But in the inside, we took part in a discussion in order to get to this pattern. It was a discussion about the original floral patterns versus the original geometric patterns and whether it was possible to mix the two together. So we did, and I think it was history in the making with this project. So those are the projects I bring with you. To many of you in this room that are already seeing the impacts underway in our world, that are witness to canary birds or part of the Canary Bird Collective, either impacted by it, of course, doing the foundational work to alleviate it, while you're also rethinking pedagogy, practice, and policy. I shared here today an approach that we're working through. Ancestral systems is the approach. It's about two-eyed seeing, and I'm hoping that it simply adds to your artillery as you move into your future, as you innovate, ideate, collaborate, recruit, and motivate. And our firm at TWOW, what we will do as a part of this partnership, we will continue to uncover the more and more systems by listening, observing, patterning, collating, and of course, sharing. The work is done together. Thank you.
Are these on? Amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It was really, really something extraordinary to watch. All of the process of thinking. I think a lot of the Indigenous folks here in the audience struggle with how to take that traditional wisdom and apply it in a world that it doesn't quite fit into. But perhaps before we get started on that, maybe our other panelists can introduce themselves.
Sure. My name is Grant Falgren. I'm a member of Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation in Northern Ontario, and I'm a second-year Master of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design student here. I'm also the chair of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects Reconciliation Advisory Committee. We're working to improve the capacity of landscape architects working across Canada to collaborate with Indigenous peoples.
Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Toledo Yate. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and also a fourth year at Mark 1 here at the GSD. Also really excited to have Wanda here. She was very pivotal in helping us form the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective here when both Elsa Hoover and I and Heidi Brando and another were all starting here at the GSD thinking about Indigenous design.
My name is Alec. I am a second-year Master in Urban Planning. I am Guawitecan, and I'm also part of the HIDC, and I'm very happy to be here. Now, do either of you have any burning questions you want to kick us off with?
I do. We're both Canadian. That's our origins. You're now working in the States. And it's been very interesting for me now to be in a very different context talking about some of the issues that we've been addressing in Canada for quite some time. And I'm wondering, some of your work is situated here in the States, like professional work, and some is in Canada. What are the sort of significant differences in practicing in those two spaces? And do you learn something from each of those contexts that you think you can bring to the other in your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the biggest difference, and I feel like a bit of an anomaly, I've been doing this for, 25 or so years, but I think one of the biggest differences I noticed, but I think it permeates on both sides of the border, is Canada has a policy of multiculturalism. So they kind of like, to uplift culture in Canada. And I think when I came to the US, it felt more, the old policy of sort of a melting pot versus celebrating culture. And so I think that's one of the big differences. And so I think it worked for me coming down, because just coming from Canada and thinking the way we think about valuing and being inspired by all cultures, I think it actually helped. In terms of the practice, I would say it's virtually the same, because I am basically an outsider in every community I go to, besides my home satellite Cree Nation. So it's really always about relearning about each community, being taught by each community, and so it's very, very similar on both sides of the border. But I think I always say I'm very blessed. I not only get to learn from my elders, but I get to learn from all the elders across North America. So amazing profession.
Thank you so much, Wanda. I think as you were talking just now about kind of this multiculturalism, and in particular in your talk, you mentioned something that I've actually have never heard articulate, but definitely felt, was this two-eyed seeing. How do we begin to bring both multiple voices to a talking point? And so my question for you, and we have a lot of people here who are also not Indigenous, but also many Indigenous voices here. And as we move forward, I think, what are common misconceptions of Indigenous design that you've encountered in your work? And then how do we efficiently move forward in kind of communicating or collaborating and working together in an effort to coalition build?
Right, that's a great question. I think when I first started pushing on the field of Indigenous design, there was a lot of appliqué of Indigenous design, which I think is fundamentally does a disservice, because I think the richness, as you see from the projects, when I was talking about the teepee value systems, there's so much embedded in these very simple structures that just putting, the symbols, the appliqué, just does a disservice. And so I think we need to get to the root of where we're taking apart the entire structure from top to bottom and all directions in order to understand the ancestral systems that exist and to do a service that way in architecture. And in terms of the coalition, I think this work is just naturally lends itself for people to come together. It begs a conversation. It has to have dialogue because it's a new subject. But I think it's happening around the world. We got a call from a group of scholars, designers in India, and they call themselves the Indigenous Design Collective, right? So there seems to be a movement happening, just emerging around the world right now. So I think those conversations are just going to continue to grow, and I'm guessing in 50 or 100 years, we might have a new way of looking at the world. Yeah, together.
Thank you, Wanda. And just for the audience to know, we're going to pass around some few questions up here for a little bit, and then we'll send somebody with a mic out in the audience in case you have any questions as well. I really appreciated your story about how you were kind of jammed into the basement with you and all the other Indigenous students, and that was kind of where you existed, but it was still such a meaningful place to you, despite the lack of sunlight, despite no windows. And so it seems like there is something that kind of weaves in and out, or is at some points entirely separate from, sometimes embedded in, the physical space. There's a whole other element to community building. And I think that really points towards a huge cultural change that is also necessary. And I really appreciated some of those principles you talked about, because it states that we all bring our values to our planning or to our architecture. And so something like looking to our elders really makes a lot of sense to my Indigenous heart, but then I look at the average age of a Senate and the senator, and they're 154, and so there's a disconnect there. And so I'm curious how you think about these things that are a little bit trickier to get at, some of these cultural things, and how you feel you've tried to get at them through your work.
That's a really good question, because you're absolutely right. We are trying to change systems, but the people who govern the systems are from another generation. And how do you incite that need for change in a system that works perfectly fine for a lot of people. Right, but I do think that the movement comes from within. You know, recently I was just sharing a story that at our school there was something called the Design Justice Initiative, and I think this happened throughout many universities, not just architecture school, but this happened in law schools and schools around the world, where students were rising up and saying, we want more diverse curriculum, we want more diverse topics, we want more diverse faculty, we want more perspectives in this work. And so I think that movement is really what our job is right now in this, you know, we're getting up there in age, I don't know. But we need to just create the platform to let them lead. And we often say, you know, while I talked about elders as being our moral compass, what we also talk about is the youth being our guides. The youth and the elders together are who guides us. And I think that sort of, that view is so important, and I think that needs to come to mainstream, right? Because it's not my future. I'm going to be gone in 20 years. It's someone else's future that will still be here, and we have to let them lead.
Got one more. Our cultures as Indigenous people developed in particular contexts in relation with particular environments. As those environments are changing now, how can design provide capacity for us to generate new stories so that our cultures continue to be aligned with those environments that are changing?
This is a really interesting question, and it relates to a project we're working on, indigenizing an urban area. It's a heavily populated urban district in the city of Calgary, and they're creating a series of performance centers through Indigenous ways of knowing. And part of our work was to actually reconceive of what a performance center is through the minds of through Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which is so incredible to be able to have that opportunity to rethink it. And when I went to, of course, we never do a project in a vacuum. We always go straight out to the community and pose the question to the community. And we asked them, and they told us that our performances look exactly like the typical performances of the Western world. And I was like, well, are you sure? Or do you think, because you have been so far removed from what your original acts of performance were, that you lost touch and that we can somehow try and reconnect them? And I don't think we could reconnect at that point, but what we did come to was the idea that the idea of a performance center is kind of a Western notion, and that in order to make it more welcoming and to increase the sense of belonging, we need to change what it is and what it does, and who's invited and who comes to these centers. So I think it's that sort of imagining, you know, and we ended up calling it the lodge and putting a big fire in it, but I think it's that sort of reimagining that we are so ripe right now to reimagine every typology that we think has to be only this way or that way. It does not. We are very different from who we were 150 years ago, and Western society is very different. So I think this two-eyed seeing can serve to kind of expand the possibilities in an urban environment.
Well, thank you very much. I think at this point we'll also open it up to any questions that might come from the audience. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and we've got some folks in the stairs, and I'll run over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the disciplines and the idea that we have architects and landscape architects and urban planners, and you mentioned the very Western framework for thinking about how we create place. So maybe just think a little and share with us your thoughts on how you navigate across those fields.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think a lot of this work, as we are kind of a design research firm, is we are interrogating who is doing great work. And we're basically taking it and trying to do a localized version. So for urban design and urban planning, we looked at Te Aranga. I was lucky enough to get a National Endowment for the Arts grant, an NEA grant, an Our Town grant, to indigenize the city of Tempe in Phoenix. So again, it's not enough to study that theory far away, right? We have to bring it home and test it and apply it and see what happens when we bring it to a local context. And of course, being an outsider, I'm not from the Southwest. I'm always intimidated when I go into a new community, and I go in very humbly. I asked 3 Indigenous artists who are from the local Southwest region to help me, and for them to ask as mediators to bring those Te Aranga principles and create a modified version that would reflect their community. They looked at those Te Aranga principles and they loved all of them. They ended up using all of them, but they condensed it into 4 instead of 7. So I think that's the strategy, right? We look around the world to see who's doing incredible work, and a lot of good work is coming out of New Zealand, and then you try and apply it. And if you can get a client, we got the city of Tempe to say yes to, and we're not indigenizing it, we're Othomizing it, which is the name for the local people. They're Otham people. So we're Othomizing the city of Tempe. And it's, a multi-year project. So to give an example of landscape is a deep one, and we work really closely. Many of you are probably familiar with SLA. It's a landscape firm in somewhere in the northern Europe. I think they're Denmark, and they work with biologists on staff. Right? They're going that deep into not just about applique and applying plants in a garden, but they're actually looking at the science behind it. And so I love working with that firm, but I think landscape is such a huge part of Indigenous worldview and the connection with the plants and ethnobotany that I think our firm will probably transition to have a small landscape component in the future, because it is such a specialized knowledge and there are so few people who specialize in Indigenous landscapes. And for all of you interested in landscapes, this is a void in our field right now. There might be, I think, 3 Indigenous landscape architects in North America. Yeah. So yeah, look at examples and hopefully apply them.
I'd actually like to ask a follow-up question to that. And as we head into COP27, was this past week, as we head into a world of what looks like unmitigated climate change, we're beginning to lose a lot of those landscapes. And indigeneity is a lot about learning from the land and taking the cues from the land. But when we lose that land, and I think current projections are in the millions in terms of people who will lose their habitats and have to migrate in this country, especially. The Rio Grande just ran out of water for the first time, went dry in the Southwest, which I'm sure you heard about. What does indigeneity look like when pretty soon everybody's an outsider because they had to leave their native lands and go to some place that they're not as familiar with?
This is a question, obviously, when it's 130 degrees down there that we all think about in Phoenix. But I think the most that we can do is actually, again, provide a platform for the people who understand water and this is their homeland in Arizona. That is all I can do, is to really give the floor to the people who are most impacted. And I've even said in my class that we should all move out of Arizona, the people that are imports. We should be the first to leave, stop your water faucets, and we should go back to an area that has abundance. And then I think we should also open our borders to allow people to move where they need to move in the future. Canada is a great example. I'm from Alberta. It gets extremely cold up there. I'm from the northernmost city in Canada. Not a lot of people want to live there, but I'm guessing that in a couple hundred years, we'll still have water up there from all of the snowfall. So that's what we should do, is be rethinking borders. And our elders, I will have to say, are also so welcoming with all of their concepts. When we design a space, they're not thinking just of Indigenous people. Every time we do a project, they're including all cultural people, all cultures in the way they think. It's just part of their philosophy. And so I think we need to start to think, that we're all the same, no matter what skin color or shape and size we are. We're kind of all the same inside.
Wanda, as I hear you talk, it brings to mind a lot of cyclical cycles of care. And especially when it comes to, elders, I think one of the biggest lessons that I've had the privilege of learning from is just what it means to give. And that giving comes from the heart, it's unconditional, and that care comes from the same place. I guess, Jen, for you is what does caring and what does giving kind of look like within architecture? Or how do like design students go about integrating that into their practice or their way of thinking?
That's a good question. And I think, you know, just as in the theory of cultural sustainability, within there is, to me, the justification of the why we need to open our minds and why we need to think broader when we practice, right? Because what are we doing if we're not listening, if we're not observing, and if we're not paying attention? The opposite is we're ignoring. And I think, you know, we've been given a method by CS theory, a path, a journey, something to follow, to think about. And so I think for me it would be really following that, really paying attention to CS theory and to really understand the impacts of not ignoring our world and all the people that live within.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question was about time and the relationship of architecture and time. And I think in a lot of Indigenous cultures, a lot of structures have been built to be either torn down when they move or eventually go back into the earth when maybe they don't want to live there, etc. But then there's this idea in like Western culture that like structures and architecture like needs to last forever, and like we have materials like concrete and glass, which, you know, I don't know what's going to happen to that in thousands of years. But I'm interested in like how you grapple with like this nature of temporality between like, you know, Indigenous idea of time and then this Western idea of time, and how does that show up in the architecture and the materials that you're using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, back in the early, you know, a couple decades ago when I started to look at it, I had that same wondering. You know, I come from a teepee people. There's really nothing left on the landscape. There might be a few boulders, you know, when we pack it up and move on, but it's very ephemeral and there's nothing there. But I think right now we're working on that, you know, the same project that we're putting a lodge, a teepee lodge as the inspiration. There are beautiful qualities of the teepee that I think we can be inspired from. You know, when we think about the translucency of the skin of a teepee, we think about the numbers, the east entrance, the clockwise movement in a teepee, the recognition or the uplifting of the notion of Father Sky. The flaps connect with wind directions. Right? It's almost like a ship in some ways to exhaust that air. And even the skirt of the teepee lifts so the wind changes. So I think there's a language within all of the Indigenous structures, even though it's not a permanent, you know, structure, that I think we should be inspired by, or we could be inspired by. And that is among every archetype that we've studied. You find those same beautiful meanings in these archetypes. But one thing I would also say is that when we think of traditional architectures, you know, I'm in the Southwest right now, and what I studied about the Southwest is, of course, the traditions of adobe. We tried to make adobe blocks with one of the communities as part of an exercise with the IDC. It was the longest day of our life. It was so hard, right? It's painstaking work to make these blocks and to stack them and to know the right chemical compounds to stick them together. We ended up making these structures, shade structures with benches, adobe benches, and these vato shade structures for the community that are still standing, but it was such arduous work. And so I think our role right now is to rethink, how do we bring the qualities of that architecture forward? You know, so from soil building in the Southwest, the University of Texas is looking at 3D printing soil. That is a sustainable architecture that would work extremely well in the Southwest, right? You know, the heat is better in the summer, it's better in the winter. I've even seen a house designed out of adobe in Phoenix, it's in the city, that they had thicker walls on the west side than the other sides, because that's where the sun sets and that's where the most heat gain comes from. And so can we start to think about variability in facades because of the weather? Possibly. Thicknesses of assemblies? Definitely. So I think there's a lot of innovation. If we did that sort of hyper-localized architecture, I think we could come up with some really interesting things. Great question.
Wanda, there's a spicy question from the viewers at home that I would like to ask if you're game. I think it's an important question. So Vance McEwen asks, or says, sustainability initiatives often have to be framed within settler capitalism, not permitted to reduce profit or growth, so we get more beautiful office buildings to grind in. How do we use ancestral design to shift power structures?
Great question. Wow. How could we use ancestral thinking to shift the power dynamics? This, I think, is an internal question. And we're in the midst of creating, the closest I have as a response to that, we're in the midst of creating a series of principles in my firm. My husband just joined Amazon recently, and they have these beautiful principles that guide everyone in the firm. And so I said, we also need principles that guide us in the firm. And one of the first principles that I came up with, I was doing it this morning as I was kind of roaming around the hotel, and I thought being positive is a principle that guides our firm. It's the first principle. I don't want to hark on kind of the negative parts of our history because it's there. We all know it's there, and we have, there's trauma and there's negativity. But focusing on the positive, I believe, has allowed the doors to open for this work. And I think I don't want to call them tricks or tips, but I think there are things like that we could all sort of use to be able to open more gates and open more doors. So I think, I'll just leave it there, but I think there are tricks. That was a great question.
Hello, greetings. I'm wondering, you spoke earlier about collective trauma, and I'm wondering, in your experience, what you feel the potential is for design to help heal collective trauma.
Oh, thank you for that. It was in reference to the school. I'm not going to get emotional, but we hear from a lot of elders, a lot of community members, and it's heavy. This work can be really heavy. And I often tell my team, I said, we are offered so many crazy projects out there, and someone asked us to do something called a colonial village. They wanted us to put a building within this colonial village. And I came back to my team and I said, do we want to do this, or is this going to be too trauma-inducing for us and we need to just back it up? And my staff said, let's do it. We have to do it. Design, and I think, in reference to the question, designing to alleviate that collective trauma is part of this work. And I think because design coalesces so many things in our world, it hosts lifeways, it brings worldviews, it provides inspiration for the future. It does so much, and I don't think we give it credit for all that it does. And I do believe, like the school with the organic shapes that the administrators were very scared about the cost of a curvilinear building, we have to try, right? We have to sit in that room and we have to listen, because I think that it's important work. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for this. My name is Christian. I am from Latin America, from Ecuador. And this is one of the greatest conferences I have ever been in my life. I will tell you why. In Ecuador, we have so many indigenous peoples. We have really different lands. It's so different than here in Canada and in the United States. But what it's really impressive to me is that the values, okay, they are similar. Okay, when we're talking about that we have a common thinking, when we have a collective thinking, when we're talking about all these values of community, of collectiveness, different kind of democracy, shared spaces, is the same. But we also have different problems. So I have two or three questions. The first one is, maybe, do you have any experience on Latin American indigenous communities when you're trying to apply these designs or architecture? And the second one is based on this description. In Latin America, we know our values. We know our cosmovision. We know about everything that is the ontology, okay, of what you're doing. But we're not applying that. We're still building, okay, in Western. We have a conversion of traditional communities to Western neighbors. And when we have these kind of opportunities, we have not think about what you're doing. You said something really interesting. I used to work years in indigenous communities. I'm just gonna share something, okay? Elderly people don't want to go to government buildings or the hospitals because the past decades they were discriminated and there were so much hate. And when you say this concept, it's something that blows my mind because I think that's the solution. So the question is, in Latin America, we don't have the same resources. Even we don't have the same kind or development of the subjects. But what do you think could be the way, okay, for a country like mine or for any other kind of populations, indigenous populations, to start thinking in this and also to start to applying this in architecture or any kind of engineering that it's not done right now?
What a great comment and question. Thank you. And no, I have not worked in South America, but I also know that there's some really strong work going on of spatial agency and, you know, pushing boundaries. So I would love to start that work, and maybe this is how it starts. It starts through a conversation. Can you email me? Let's start talking of how we can just mobilize a little bit, because it only takes a tiny bit. You know, I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the word Indigenous design wasn't even a thing. Like, it's that quick how these things uptake. It is that quick. And so I think a couple of lectures here and there, I don't know what we can do. Let's do something. I love your comment. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I guess I have to say something because I teach here just starting this fall, and I'm also from Ecuador, soy de Guayaquil. Hola, por favor, mándame un correo después y estemos en contacto. Because I agree that in Ecuador there are so many misconceptions about indigenous practice, but I feel like I also want to say that there's a lot of North-South conversation, particularly between Canada and South America. There's a big Congress of Indigenous Architecture, takes place every 2 years. Actually, the only country that was missing was the United States. Not so surprising. So there are, I just want you to know that there are more conversations also in South America, and hopefully some of them are now present also here. Sorry, I had to say something, and we'll talk more. I don't want to take up space.
Thank you. And our director, our new director at the design school, Paolo Sanguiniti, I have trouble pronouncing your name, but she's also from South America, and she sees a bit of a movement happening. So I think it's rising. It is absolutely rising.
I'm reacting to Chaco culture, which was in effect, a means of integrating the earth to the universe, which meant that they could determine seasonal variations, which gave them a means to orient towards their earth in a real way, such as planting or otherwise. And then there was a serious ecological problem which forced Anastasi to disperse, which had causality possibly behind similar sort of desiccation in the environment, which is similar to what's happening in the Southwest now. And then I also once visited the Gila River, and of course that was a cave dwelling. environment for the indigenous people. And then I'm going to like extrapolate into this picture here, because what I see here is modernism. Particularly the upper slides are the GSD parlance from the 70s would describe that as interpenetration. But down here, it's juxtaposition. And the juxtaposition was more like Greco-modern or Roman influence, which, realizing, that influences basically the Western idea of architecture. But the indigenous people didn't have that basis whatsoever. You're coming from a totally different angle. And that's what interests me, is that your origin doesn't necessarily have to be forced by Western ideology.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's the combining of the two ways of looking at the world. And of course, we've been indoctrinated in architecture for a long time in a certain way. And I think it's trying to pull ourselves, and that's why I teach through the concepts of Indigenous futurity, is to push my students outside of the boundaries that they have around them and to push through. So I think it's a very interesting observation. Thank you.
We've got time for one more question. No pressure, make it really, really good.
Hello, I'm Kendall Nicholson. I'm a current MDes student here. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about how you navigate indigenous ways of thinking about space and design in either non-indigenous communities or venues. And also, I'm kind of curious if you ever feel like you are, I guess I'm also curious about how you navigate being in potentially being boxed into a specific, identity that means something to different people.
It is a great question. As a finale, my whole last 25 years or so have been trying to release myself out of the box. But I was reminded by David Fortin. He used to be the director of the Laurentian University, the architecture school there. He reminded me that I was pushing back even in architecture school, because I had just finished traveling around the world. I had just seen adobe and grass huts and, rock caves. And I had seen everything except for a white box, which is what my instructors wanted me to produce in 1990, whatever. And I said, well, nobody lives in white boxes where I've just seen 40 countries. Nobody's in a white box. This doesn't make any sense to me. And so that sort of broad view came very early on, and it was through traveling. And so this is the box that you have to question. And I think part of our work as architects, right, because we have so many things coming into our work, so many influences, and there's so much change, that all of our work should be a productive disruption of whatever it is that you believe in, that you aspire to, that you think the world should be. We should never conform to what, I'm sorry, but what you're being taught. You should use what you know, what you believe to be true, and to push on that. Because if I didn't give that push, I would have been making white boxes for the last 25 years. Do you know what I mean? And thinking that that was the truth. So I think we do really have a lot of work to do, and I think the indoctrination process that is architecture, it's hard to move around. It is hard because there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure to conform. There's a lot of pressure to produce. But maybe we have to step back. I think we need to step back a little bit and to think while we're producing, to really think deeply every time we put our pen to paper.
I think that's a great thing to think about as we head into finals. You honor us with your presence. Thank you for being here.